Sometimes when I thumb through my record collection, which includes not only vinyl LPs, but also 45 RPM singles and CDs, I'll come across something that'll kind of leap out at me, and I'll look at the artist or the song and go, wow, I haven't thought about that or even heard it for years. But as I look at the cover, all the memories come flooding back. And very often, I can go right ahead and quote the lyrics or the lines to the song. Well before the dawn of classic rock, about the time, I guess maybe the Goons were recording some records, well before Monty Python's Flying Circus, there were some comedians that put out some very, very funny records. And this was all before the British invasion and the Beatles changed music forever. So let's wind the Wayback Machine and go back in time and revisit some of these humorous records. You ready to have a laugh? Well then, let's drop the needle. In 1962, before the Beatles invaded the U.S., the country was awash in Camelot. We had a young president in JFK who had a very pretty wife and two adorable kids. And there was a comic who decided that he could mimic the Bostonian accent of the president, and he decided he would release an album, which became a smash. And the artist, of course, is Vaughn, and it's called The First Family. It sold 7.5 million copies, unheard of, especially for a comedy album. It was the fastest selling album in the U.S. at that time. Even President Kennedy was enamored by the album, and he got copies which he would give out to people at the White House as Christmas presents. Now, in 1963, Vaughn Meader decides to put out a second release, which is called The First Family Volume 2. And it sells, but it's nowhere near as successful as the first one. And then President Kennedy got assassinated, and all of a sudden the country is not into humor, making fun of the late president. And retailers pulled the First Family record from the stores, and Vaughn Meader's career just came to a screeching stop. There was a single which included a JFK-related song called St. Nick Visits the White House, but that was quickly pulled out of circulation as well. So if you have a copy of that single, hang on to it, because it'll be worth something. Vaughn Meader continued to work over the years, but basically his career didn't really go anywhere. And he died in 2004. But if you want to relive Camelot, listen to The First Family, Volume 1. Now, with these comedy albums, and all of them are really kind of out of print, I'm going to try something a little bit different. And again, YouTube, this is for educational reasons, but I have found clips of a lot of these songs on YouTube. And so when I can, and when it's appropriate, I will insert the clip into this program. In 1952, there was a TV producer who also dabbled in writing satirical song parodies, and his name was Allan Sherman. And he created a TV show that became I've Got a Secret. Of course, that became a big hit, but he had some disagreements with the network, and he was fired from the show in 1958. However, I Got a Secret continued to run for 15 years. Allan Sherman lived in LA, and his next-door neighbor was Harpo Marx. And Harpo liked to throw parties, and he knew that Allan could write satirical comedy songs. So he would invite Allan over to his parties with the condition that Allan would entertain his friends. And it always went over really well. Well, one night at one of these parties, one of his friends was George Burns. And George Burns was so enamored with what Allan Sherman was doing, he called a friend of his at Warner Records and said, "You need to give this guy a recording contract." So that's how Allan Sherman got a recording contract, thanks to George Burns and Harpo Marx. So in 1962, Allan Sherman releases his first album called My Son the Folk Singer, and it is a big hit, sells over 1 million copies. So he follows it up with a second album in 1963 called My Son the Celebrity. And it contains the same format as his first album in that it mixes cultural references with a lot of Jewish humor. And once again, it's a big hit. But it was his next album called My Son the Nut, which firmly established Allan Sherman in my young, impressionable mind and in lots of teenagers' minds across the country, because it contained Allan Sherman's smash hit, Hello Muddah Hello Faddah. The song tells the story of a young Allan Sherman being at Camp Granada and sending a letter home to his parents. And in the letter, he describes the horrors of being at camp.
Hello, Muddah. Hello, Faddah. Here I am at Camp Granada. Camp is very entertaining, and they say we'll have some fun if it stops raining.
He talks to the campers having deadly diseases and how he's afraid of being left out in the forest and being eaten by a bear. As I say, paints a pretty dismal picture. However, by the end of the song, the end of the letter home, he says, hey, it stopped raining, and we're going swimming, we're going sailing, and we're doing all these funny things. And then the song and the letter ends with, Muddah Faddah, please disregard this letter. The album reaches #1, and a few years later, the Library of Congress picks it for preservation, citing its historical, cultural aesthetics. But Allan Sherman could never catch that lightning again, and a couple of things happened. One, with, like I said, the assassination of President Kennedy, the country was really not into humor. And then the Beatles came and played Ed Sullivan. And all of a sudden, the only records that anybody wanted to listen to were things from the British invasion. In 1973, Allan Sherman died at the age of 48. Next up is definitely a one-hit wonder. It's by an artist called Jerry Samuels. Yeah, you probably don't recognize that name. He went by the name of Napoleon XIV. And this is an annoying novelty song. They're coming to take me away, ha ha. For some reason, this became a huge hit. It soars to #1 in the US, 2 in Canada, and 4 in the UK. But even though the song was inane and somewhat annoying, when you flipped over the 45, the flip side was even more annoying, because all they did is take the song and press it backwards on the flip side. So it's the same song, but you're just going to hear it backwards. Jerry Samuels recorded a sequel follow-up, but it went nowhere. And so the song kind of faded into oblivion. Until in the early 70s, when I was working, I've talked about this before, working at a radio station in Los Angeles, KPPC in Pasadena, which was an FM underground station, and you could play or do anything you wanted. One of my fellow disc jockeys was a guy named Stephen Clean, who on air called himself the obscene Stephen Clean. And one night he invited this guy that he met who was a record collector, and he would collect really odd stuff. And so he went on Stephen's show and he played a song called Transfusion. And Stephen Clean said, "You must be really demented to have a record and play a record like that." And so the young man, whose name was Barry Hansen, quickly decided he would take on a stage persona of Dr. Demento. And so as a result, he got to do some of his own shows there at the radio station. And I remember a couple of times, because he was not very technically oriented at that time, a couple of times when he'd have his radio show, he would just be there announcing, and I would actually be in the booth spinning the records and running the commercials and all that kind of stuff as he did the announcing. So I guess I was Dr. Demento's engineer for a while. But I've saved the best comedic artist that we're going to talk about in this episode to last. This man could do anything. He could write and perform on radio. He could write and perform on television. He could write and perform ads. And he could write comedy records and comedy parody songs. Like I said, he could do everything. And he was everywhere. And his name, of course, is Stan Freberg. Capitol Records in Los Angeles decided they would start a spin-off label that would be just spoken word. And so one of the first artists that they signed to do that was Stan Freberg. Now, Stan's first record is a song that's called John and Marcia. And all it is Stan doing both voices. And all he says is John, Marcia, John, Marcia. But as the song goes on, he changes the intonations that John and Marcia are using when talking to each other. They go from somewhat enamorous to somewhat angry. A couple of the radio stations refused to play the song because they thought it was a little bit too risque. In 1957, he releases an album called A Child's Garden, and this is a great record, contains great songs. It's got a parody of Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel, where the echo machine gets out of control. Then there's the Great Yellow Rose of Texas, where a Yankee drummer sabotages the recording. And I like how he skewers the Platters hit, The Great Pretender, and Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line. Also in that year, he decides to take on one of the most popular songs at the time, which was Harry Belafonte's Banana Boat song, the Day-O, Day-O, daylight come and we want to go home. Well, Freberg fractures it because in his recording, the singer has to leave the studio and walk down the hall because every time he says, Day-O, the drummer playing bongos is a beatnik drummer who goes, too shrill, man, too shrill. So the singer ends up going down the hallways, closing the doors, and as his voice gets more and more muffled, the drummer keeps going, too shrill, too piercing. But he didn't just go after recording stars. He went after TV stars as well. And one of the biggest television shows at the time, and I know it's hard to imagine this now, was called The Lawrence Welk Show. And Lawrence Welk was a leader of an orchestra, and he played, of all things, an accordion. And then he'd have the orchestra on the show, and they were known for their kind of schmaltzy music, and he referred to it as their champagne music makers. And as a result, they had a bubble machine. And so during the show, when they would start playing, the orchestra start playing, then all these bubbles would come up, supposedly champagne bubbles. Well, you can see where this is going to go when Freberg gets a hold of it, because he calls it wonderful, wonderful, which was kind of the way Lawrence Welk pronounced wonderful, wonderful when he was on the air. And in Freberg's vision, the orchestra is playing in a ballroom, and the bubble machine takes over and gets out of control and literally floats the ballroom up and takes it away. Then in 1961, Stan Freberg releases what's probably his masterpiece of comedic albums. And it's called Stan Freberg Presents the United States of America, Volume 1, The Early Years. The album covers history through the fractured lens of Freberg, from 1942, when Columbus lands, to the end of the Revolutionary War. It's pretty hilarious. In 2019, this album is also selected by the Library of Congress for preservation because of its cultural significance. In 1996, a much older Stan Freberg revisits this and comes up with Stan Freberg Presents the United States of America, Volume 2. Besides recording, as I said, he worked in advertising and set up his own ad agency and created some of the most memorable television and radio ads that have ever been produced. And a bunch of them were collected on a 4-CD set called Tip of the Freberg. Now, for the Heinz Soup TV ad, if you can find this, you ought to definitely take a look at it, because what he's got is a very famous singer who's also a dancer, Ann Miller. And she's playing a housewife, and her husband wants to know what's for dinner, and all of a sudden she breaks into song and dance about the wonders of soup. And it becomes a big Hollywood stage production. You know, lots of dancers and everything going on. It's pretty crazy. And at the end of it, her husband is kind of disgruntled and goes, "Gee, what is it with you that everything has to be such a big production?" But my favorite Stan Freberg ad, it's called Stretch Your Imagination. And basically what he's doing is he's talking about radio and how important radio is. And he's making a point about the things that you can do on radio that you could never do on television. And it is hilarious. Take a listen.
Radio? Why should I advertise on radio? There's nothing to look at, no pictures.
Listen, you can do things on radio you couldn't possibly do on TV.
That'll be the day.
All right, watch this. Okay, people, and now when I give you the cue, I want the 700-foot mountain of whipped cream to roll into Lake Michigan, which has been drained and filled with hot chocolate. Then the Royal Canadian Air Force will fly overhead towing a 10-ton maraschino cherry, which will be dropped into the whipped cream to the cheering of 25,000 extras. All right, cue the mountain. Cue the Air Force. Cue the maraschino cherry. Okay, 25,000 cheering extras. Now, you want to try that on television?
Well...
You see, radio is a very special medium because it stretches the imagination.
Doesn't television stretch the imagination?
Up to 21 inches, yes.
No question, Stan Freberg was a comedic genius. So check out some of his stuff. I can guarantee you'll have a good laugh. He died at the age of 88 in 2015. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. So there you have it, some comedic gems from before the classic rock period that were in my record collection. You never know what's going to jump out next. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep a laughing and keep a rocking. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.